But the one I want to get to today is How Progressives Cling to the Past, Foundation for Economic Education by Logan Albright. Now, he posted this on the 26th of this month also, or wait a minute. Yeah, the 26th of this month also. Now, the political left, particularly in its extreme forms, have always been skillful in the use of language to further its ends. Recognizing that perception matters more than reality, exponents of socialism and communism use words in a particularly Orwellian way, imparting meanings to words directly opposite to what their etymologies would lead us to suspect. A well-known example of the word liberal, which derives from Latin liber, free, originally applied to thinkers who favored individual liberty and small government. The word now, thanks to tireless efforts on the left, connotes an advocate of high taxes and invasive regulations. What leftists really want is to return to a culture both primitive and tribal. A less recognized perversion of language can be found in the term progressive, now preferred to liberal by many on the left. It's not hard to see why a movement would desire such a label. Progressive connotes progress. Progress is, by definition, a good thing. Nobody speaks of progress towards bankruptcy or tyranny. Progress implies movement towards a desirable goal. Well, who could be against that? But here again, the word doesn't mean what you would expect. In fact, it means quite the opposite. For all their talk of progress, what leftists really want, the foundation on which all of their ideas are based, is a return to a culture both primitive and tribal, and I'll explain. The word progressive, in the early 20th century, when the term progressive began to be used, it had some merit in that it was not wholly dishonest. Progressives of that time were interested in science, technology, and the future. American eugenists sought to apply the theories of Charles Darwin and George Mendel to the human race, engineering a more perfect species through scientific design. The Italian futurists may have been fascists, but at least they were honest about their desire to tear down the traditional structures and look only forward. All of this was built upon the writings of Marx and Hegel, who claimed that the tide of history was something more than accumulation of chance events, but rather a force with definite direction leading us all into a predetermined future of global communism. The remnants of this movement are seen today in the cultural Marxism that attempts to destroy religion, the family, and even the well-worn institutions of gender. The word has been attached to a wide variety of leftist policies, which are, in a word, regressive. In the century since progressivism rose as a popular movement, however, the word has lost much of its meaning and has instead been attached to a wide variety of leftist policies, which are, in a word, regressive. The most obvious, example of this is the collectivist tendency towards economic egalitarianism. In the worldview of the socialist, we should all be materially equal, and it is unjust for some to have more than others. Property, we are told, is theft, and social justice demands the constant redistribution of wealth to ensure that the rich are not better off than the poor. What lies behind this? It is an altruistic concern for the well-being of the poor? Hardly. If you listen to the rhetoric of the egalitarians, they are less concerned with bringing the poor up as to bringing the rich down. As Margaret Thatcher put it in describing the views of left-wing opponent, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided that the rich were less rich. A primitive worldview. Now we're getting down to the nuts and bolts of this article that I really want to get to. There is a word for this, although it is seldom discussed and more seldom understood. The word is envy, the resentment of someone else's success. This is not to be confused with jealousy, which is to desire what someone else has. And a biblical term of that would be covetousness. Some people might, especially in the Christian, Christian circles, people would understand that jealousy probably would be better translated covetousness, which is the desire to what someone else has. Envy merely yearns to spitefully diminish those who succeed. Why should men envy one another? The answer lies in a mistaken worldview, one that views economic life as a zero-sum game. In short, the belief that one man's gain must necessarily be another man's loss. And this is, folks, this is the whole regressive leftist idea when it comes to taxes, when it comes to wealth redistribution, when it comes to just about anything they think about. Okay? Everything to them is a zero-sum game. If you advance, someone has to lose just because you advanced. And that, folks, that's just not the case. If you've listened to the show long enough, you know that's not the case. But I go on here. The idea that there's something inherently wicked about success is as old as man himself. Nothing is more primitive than this way of looking at the world. Even the most cursory study of anthropology reveals how common it is among tribes untouched by civilization, where the success of individual members is attributed to witchcraft, the evil eye, or some other supernatural method of prospering at the expense of others. In classical mythology, the gods are frequently motivated by envy to lash out at successful humans. One is reminded of Ereshkigal, a shepherd's daughter who turned into a spider by Athena for the sin of being good at weaving. Even the story of the time. Now this, I'm going to have to correct this in here, but I'm going to read what he has and I'll correct it after I read it. Even the story of the Tower of Babel in the Old Testament sees humans cooperating to build an impressive structure only to be cast down and their language is confused by an envious God. The idea that there's something inherently wicked about success is as old as man himself. Now, let's go back to the story of the Tower of Babel. It wasn't that God was envious. God didn't need to be envious of man and their accomplishments. Okay? But if they were left to their own devices and they stayed that way, there would be nothing that would be out of their reach to do. And that wasn't God's purpose for man here on earth. That absolutely was not their purpose. And so it wasn't that God was envious of them, because God created the heavens and the earth, for goodness sake. You know, God has nothing to be envious of man. So I just wanted to correct that. But anyway, it is only by abandoning such magical thinking and embracing the ideas of private property and individualism as humanity managed to claw its way out of the depths of poverty and privation that characterized early man. In his exhaustive treatment of envy as a motivator of social behavior, socialist Helmut Schoeck comments on the irony of progressivism. The actual point of departure for socialist and for left-wing progressive generally is identical with that of particularly envy-inhabited primitive people. What for more than a century has made itself out as a progressive mental attitude is no more than regression to a kind of childhood stage of human economic thinking. And let me stop the reading there. What he's talking about, the childhood stage of human economics. Think back when you had a toy. You know, if you're playing together, in order for your playmate to have more toys than you, if he wasn't given one, guess what? They'd take it from you. And you didn't like that. Now, he may have been envious because you had the better Tonka toys. Okay? So he might take one from you, and then there might be a fight. There usually was. But this is a childhood stage of human economic thinking. You know, that I had, in order for me to gain, I had to take from somebody. In order for my gain to happen, someone had to lose. And again, we have Nobel Prize winning economists like Paul Krugman at the New York Times. He's a New York Times columnist who thinks this way. He got a Nobel Prize for this. Go figure that one out, right? I read on. F.A. Hayek elaborates on this in his The Fatal Conceit, in which he argues that the socialist impulse is a natural one because it conforms to the ancient structures of tribes and families where property is shared and the individual is less important than the group. The error comes in applying the same model to large groups of unrelated strangers where the bonds that hold tribes together and enforce accountability are almost wholly absent. Progressivism, regressivism. It is almost comical to watch the so-called progressives deride conservatives for allegedly trying to cling on to the past while at the same time condemning all that is new in favor of ancient superstition and folly. For all its pro-science rhetoric, the progressive movement maintains a hostility to technological advances. Let me stop reading here. This is no more, I mean, there's a whole bunch of evidence in this when it comes to the science of a creation science. Looking into and trying to answer the question, the hypotheses, was this world created or did we evolve? And that's a legitimate science. But the regressive left doesn't look at it this way. They don't look at, they look at that we're stepping backwards because we're looking at God instead of, creation science is a relatively new science that is looking into the questions of where did we come from? And it's a legitimate, in my opinion, and if my opinion means anything to anybody, in my opinion, that is a legitimate course of study. It's a question asked that needs answered. That a lot of people find that the scientific world that believes in evolution, their answers have been found wanting because it leads on a lot of things. I don't want to go into that. I just wanted to put that out for you folks. Economics is not only an area in which the progressive betray their reverence for the past, but for all of its pro-science rhetoric, the progressive movement maintains a hostility to technological advances like genetically modified crops and ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft, usually on protectionist grounds. And of course, little need to be said about the radical environmentalists who openly long for time when humans barely existed in enough numbers to make an impact on the planet. Yet in pointing out that progressivism is actually regressive, it is important not to fall into the opposite fallacy that something is bad simply because it is old or good because it's new. This is certainly not the case in many instances. There is much to be said for ancient traditions such as roaring bonfires and the nuclear family. While the fact that selfie sticks are a recent invention does not make them less of a cancer upon the planet. One must remain suspicious, however, of an ideology that disguises its true nature by claiming to be forward-looking when it's actually rooted in the distant past. With this in mind, I suggest that those of us who value truth and integrity cease our continual retreat into the battle of words and instead mount a rare counteroffensive. Let us call the brand of primitive collectivism what it really is. I propose the term regressivism, and I hope you will join me in this adoption. And yeah, I've been skirting around the fringes of that for quite a while now about regressivism, and actually saying what I mean when I say that. So I'm going to start using regressivism instead of calling them progressives. They're the regressive left, and what they're practicing is regressivism. And again, they want to go back to failed systems of the past. And someone shared a joke with me on Facebook. A socialist is just a lazy communist that hasn't got up and went the extra steps to communism, which I thought was kind of comical and funny. I really did. Oh, folks, I tell you what.